New ones. Welcome to Live at Lunch. For those of you that haven't been here before, it's a noon hour lecture series. It's free, and we always have a variety of guest speakers and sometimes internal staff on a wide variety of topics. So it's usually on the third Wednesday of each month. My name is Alex, and I'm a learning program developer here at the museum. And I'm honored to present and work here today on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the individual indigenous nations who have cared for it from before the arrival of settler peoples until this day. I also want to acknowledge that April is Sikh Heritage Month, a time to recognize and highlight the many contributions that Sikh communities have made to this province and country's political, economic, and cultural heritage, while not forgetting the struggles and discrimination that these communities have also faced. We are very excited and honored to have Paneet Singh joining us as our guest lecturer. Paneet will be sharing the story of Mewa Singh, an individual largely celebrated as a martyr in Canada's Sikh and South Asian communities. Paneet is a Punjabi-Sikh playwright and filmmaker whose work is largely inspired and informed by Sikh and South Asian cultures and histories. And many of you may have seen his nationally televised documentary films, Pressbreaker and the Ecstatic. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Paneet on stage. And set up your... Here we go.
Thank you.
There you are, and then you can just use the arrows.
Fantastic. Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Thank
Good afternoon?
Yeah.
Afternoon. Time is relative.
Grab my phone.
Yes,
So
please
it's
do.
not distracting.
Yeah, I'm going to be boring anyway. You should text people during the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Paneet Singh. And given that it is Sikh Heritage Month, I would like to offer the Khalsa Sikh greeting to you, which is Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I do want to acknowledge before starting as well, just for myself, that we're gathered on the lands of the Lekwungen, now known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. It's in gratitude and humility that I'm here today. I've been living on these lands for almost the past 3 years after spending the first 30 odd years of my life in the Lower Mainland. So it's an honor to be here today to talk about some complex histories as we are all navigating our complex relationships with these lands. I'm not an academic out of the gate. I'm an artist, I'm a storyteller, I'm a filmmaker, a playwright. Community historian has been thrown around every now and then, but really this is a passion project for me. History is a passion project for me. It's a part of my own interest, my own being a nerd, my own spiritual practice, my own discipline. It's for me. And by extension, because for me, such an important part of my being is community, this is also for my community. This story, Mewa Singh's story, is one it's close to my heart because I grew up not far from where Mewa Singh was executed, a walking distance on the border of Burnaby, New West, and so that carries a lot of gravitas when you're living as a Punjabi-Sikh with visible faith signifiers. That someone who looked like you, someone who you count among your ancestors, was executed a stone's throw from your own house. It carries a lot of gravitas. So it's something that I'm passionate about, that I care about, that I've written about. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention before starting that I owe a lot of everything that I've learned in this world of research and history to my colleagues and really close friends, Dr. Mewa Singh and Naveen Gurn, with whom I have the honor of being on the Nameless Collective podcast based on Sikh and South Asian history, or South Asian history in Canada. So shout out to them, because without community we are nothing, and they're more than just colleagues. They're my elder siblings, and they've offered me so much. And so a lot of what I've learned in terms of research practice and that kind of thing has come from them. So I do want to acknowledge them as just because they're my homies. I was told 45 minutes, 30 to 45. I'm taking that as 45 because I talk a lot. And this is the way this is going to go. The context for this story is large, going anywhere from 1880 to 1902 up until 1915. It's a large span of time to cover. I'm not going to cover the whole thing. I'm going to give you like a wide, broad stroke of racial history in the early 20th century in what we call BC in like 5 minutes. And I'm going to get us to like the actual negotiating criminality conversation as quick as possible, hopefully like 15 minutes on. That's why we could take like a half hour to get into really the complexity of the story, and it is. So if you don't know, it's very simple. Maybe you Googled Mewa Singh before you got here. Mewa Singh, in October of 1914, assassinated a Canadian immigration inspector by the name of William Charles Hopkinson. He was sped through court in what is perhaps the quickest recorded... Hello. It's nice to have friends in the audience. Perhaps the quickest recorded execution in the history of the British Empire, and was hanged to death in January 1915 in New Westminster. That's the Coles Notes. So if we look at today's context, which I want to talk about very quickly. Now you probably can't see that from where you're sitting. Who are these really, in the grand scheme of things? Mewa Singh and Hopkinson, assassinator and the deceased, are footnotes on the larger Komagata Maru story, or even in like Canadian racial history. Often that's what it's reduced to. And so when you Google it, when you Google Mewa Singh, or you think about where Mewa Singh's name comes into the public conversation, here on the right side, or your left side of that screen for you, is just the first half of 1915 criminals who were executed by the Canadian state, right? So take that for what it is. That's just what that list is. They were criminals, they were killed, whether they were hanged or otherwise. And there's Mewa Singh's name at January 11th, 1915. And now we look at the right side of the screen, and you can see that monument is that monument to fallen officers. It's right behind the ledge, just steps away from here. The top name on that monument is Immigration Officer William C. Hopkinson, 1914 Canadian Immigration. So memorialized, right? Fallen officers. We usually in the public discourse, it's a hero. Fallen in the line of duty. That's the kind of conversation we have around it. And that's it. If anyone doesn't interrogate this narrative, that's it. Here's this criminal. He was executed. Here's this officer who fell in the line of duty. It's memorialized. And now it's 110 years later. That to me is a problem. Coming from the context of where we started this conversation of Mewa Singh being someone I consider one of my ancestors, despite no blood relation, who was executed feet from where I am, who I grew up with a completely different sensibility about, is reduced to just a name in a list. And the person that he executed is memorialized without interrogation. So that's what we want to negotiate here, is like what was going on at the time, and why is this person, who is really just a murderer in the eyes of institutional history, is such an important figure for the Sikh community, for the South Asian community, especially not just in BC, but especially down the West Coast. So with that historical context, I'm only going to talk about 3 things today, and that is establishing the Khalsa Diwan Society, the continuous journey regulation, and the Komagata Maru. And I will tell you the Komagata Maru story in perhaps the fastest you've ever heard it in your life, in a way that it should never be told, but functionally needs to be today. Also, I have one goal today, and that goal isn't to be the funniest person you've ever met, but maybe like in the top 10. Like you leave, be like, yeah, if I'm thinking about the funniest people I met in my life, that dude at RBCM, that top 10 for sure. All against the backdrop of murder. So here we go. Establishing the Khalsa Diwan Society. Somewhere between 1880 and 1902, that's a large range, South Asians started making their way over to these lands. That's a disjointed history. It's a complex history. I'm not going to get into it. Really, we can start looking at 1902 to 1904 when migration really starts beginning to happen, predominantly from the Punjab region of what is split across modern-day India and Pakistan. So that's happening 1902, 1904. By 1906, we have somewhere in the conversation of 5,000 South Asians living in Canada, predominantly in the Lower Mainland and Capital Region, in like 99% in what's colonially known as British Columbia. So that's 1906. In that time, this is seen as like an influx. There's newspaper articles that say Hindu invasion coming all down the West Coast. And this is happening not just in the province, but all down the West Coast. And this is a problem. This community is quickly scapegoated by a lot of the local municipalities, the provincial, the federal governments, of being like a strain on why folks who are working in labor were not getting employment. Common kind of rhetoric we see around immigration happening even today. And so it's the same old racism, different brand. So in 1906, the Sikhs and South Asian, in 1906, the year, Sikhs, the people, and South Asians gathered to create the Khalsa Diwan Society. And the Khalsa Diwan Society is formalized with the building of a Gurdwara, or a Sikh place of worship, in 1908 in Kitsilano on 2nd Avenue. If you're familiar with the Lower Mainland, that's where those like high-end Porsche and Jaguar dealerships are now. Cool little gentrification anyway. But that used to be a very intercultural neighborhood, in Kitsilano being closer to the edge of the city at that time, which the city of Vancouver only went up to 12th Avenue. So this was on 2nd Avenue. The Khalsa Diwan Society, primarily operating as a Sikh place of worship, was also the community gathering space for all South Asians. Now, I'm going to use the word South Asian a lot, and it's a reductive term, but it is the easiest term for me to use right now. Please don't put me on blast on social media. I'm looking at one person in the audience. He's my friend, but I'm looking at him. Paneet Singh is erasing the history of the Sikhs. It's layered reasoning. I've already acknowledged it's predominantly Punjabi-Sikhs that I'm talking about at this time, but I'm not going to pretend like other South Asians were not here and didn't exist. Right now, it's easiest for me to use the term Sikh and South Asian. So, with the establishing of this Gurdwara, this is where all of the civil rights cases were fought. This is where all the political activity was taking place from, along with the spiritual center of the community. Bear in mind, there was no masjid, or what you might say is mosque for the Muslim community. There was no mandras for the Hindu community. This was the spiritual center for all religious communities coming from South Asia, along with being the political community center, the social center of the community. So that's 1906. 1906, the government's like, we got a problem, too many brown people, how do we stop this? There's two things that happened. One of them was called the British Honduras Scheme. I'm not going to get into it today. If you're not familiar with it, you should definitely look it up, because it was an attempt by the Canadian government in cooperation with a large corporation, Chiquita Bananas, to try to deport 5,000 South Asians from the country, which ultimately failed. So that happened in 1906, 7, 8. At the same time, when it's like, wow, too many brown people, what do we do? They came up with a continuous journey regulation, which you might be familiar with, which is kind of the crux of where the Komagata Maru conversation starts. Continuous journey regulation is very simple. If you want to immigrate to Canada, you have to do it on a non-stop journey from your country of origin. And that means that, so if you were coming from India, you have to do a non-stop, flight, a non-stop ship journey from a port in India all the way to Canada. No commercial company did that at the time. And it was considered to be like probably not possible, or extremely, extremely hard, effectively cutting off immigration in 1908. So in 1906, we have about 5,000. 1908, that number is going to stay still. Going past this story that we're going to cover today, by about 1919, these restrictive immigration laws are so effective that the estimations of how small the South Asian population got in Canada go anywhere from 250 to 800, which is is incredible. That's like a vast majority of the community, either going back to India, losing their lives in the struggle for independence, or just deciding not to come back, and because they can't do family reunification past 1919, or up until 1919, there's no conversation of formally women entering the country, of families reuniting. So that these immigration laws are effective over the course of this next decade or so. And people argue like, oh, it's continuous journey regulation, but it wasn't just for brown people, it was for everybody. And here's a great quote straight from the Hansards. So this was in Ottawa, on the record. The wonderful Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Prime Minister of Canada, when asked about the continuous journey regulation, said that, quote, "We have power to exclude and to deport certain immigrants who do not come up to a certain standard, either physically, intellectually, or morally, and whom we deem to be unworthy of Canadian citizenship. We have power to deport Hindus," Hindus here being, of course, the racialized use of the word, widely referring to South Asian or brown people. We have power to deport Hindus or anyone else if we are of opinion that they come within any of the classes I have referred to. Not a lot left to imagination. I believe Wolf Laurier went back home, closed the door, and was like, "That was good racism. I did good racism today." It's a joke. I saw someone like, "Oh, really?" No. That's the quiet part, the subtext. So that was Laurier. It also came up in the same discussion when this bill is being debated. Well, what if there's a German person who was living in Australia and then now has come to Canada? And there's an explicit mention, well, it's like, well, we hope the immigration inspector would use their good sense and let them into the country. So again, not a lot left to imagination, because there's a lot of devil advocacy. Well, it's like, well, they were just following the law of the time, but they were also kind of just saying that the law is racist. Barring that word, they were all but saying that. So there's continuous journey regulation in place from 1908 to 1914. The Komagata Maru journey. Komagata Maru journey happens like this. 1913, there's a Punjabi man by the name of Gurdit Singh, who lives in Singapore. He's a businessman. He is originally from the village Sarhali in India. And he's like, there's a business opportunity and also opportunity to challenge the color bar with the restrictive immigration laws in Canada. So we're going to charter our own ship, the Komagata Maru, which the community christened the Guru Nanak Jahaj, or the ship of Guru Nanak. And we're going to take this ship over to Canada and kind of put up a fight against this restrictive immigration law. They make stops, 2 stops in Asia along the way, pick up more passengers. 376 passengers arrive into Canada. In Canada, they're held at the port Alberni. Some stuff goes down. They're like, we're not going to stop here. We're going to go to downtown. They arrive in Burrard Inlet. In Burrard Inlet, they're not allowed into, the passengers are not allowed off. There's a test case to be like, oh, if one passenger will be allowed, they'll all be allowed. The test case fails. So then nobody is allowed except for 24 passengers who had previously been to Canada already, so had technically already gained entry. Those 24 passengers get off. The remaining 326 passengers go back to India and arrive in the port called Baj in the city of Calcutta. And in Calcutta, the British Indian Army open fires and arrests and forcibly moves large amounts of those passengers back to Punjab. That's the Komagata Maru story. That was 6 months. It was grossly undertold. There was a 2-month journey there. There was 2 months sitting in Burrard Inlet when the Canadian government wouldn't fulfill things like minimum amounts of food and water for the passengers. There was an attempt at forcibly removing the Komagata Maru with police ships, and a 2-month journey back where they're met by fire from the British Indian Army. That's the story that this story is set against the backdrop of. And that's kind of what's going on at this time. There's not a lot left to the imagination if we look at it in other ways, not to mention the building of the CPR in the years leading up to this, which has led to the devastation of so many Indigenous nations and displacement of so many Indigenous nations. Also, there's the Chinese head tax that comes into place at this time. There's the race riots that are happening in Bellingham, in Vancouver, in Chinatown. Stuff is bad, y'all. It's just not a good time. But that's the backdrop that we're up against here. We good? Is that enough context? Okay, cool. If you forget, just remember, it's like, what was Paneet Singh in the starting? Oh yeah, it was bad. That's all you really need to know. Okay, now, within this backdrop, within the Sikh and South Asian community, there is another kind of struggle happening. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, way over past my context limit, but that's all right. And this is something called Ghadarites versus, and there's different words used, British loyalists, Crown loyalists, the immigration department. But this is a struggle within the community. So Ghadarites, the Ghadar revolution was born out of the west coast of Turtle Island, being founded in Astoria and Oregon, and going up and down the west coast. And what it was is that it called for the armed resistance of the British occupation of India. And so that it continued for decades, and that movement was actually born here on Turtle Island and not in India itself. So it was the organization of West Coast immigrants who had gotten together from India, who had gotten together to make this organization, which was called the Ghadar Party. So the Ghadarites were fiercely, fiercely anti-British. And they had perhaps the silent, and this is a little bit of conjecture, but I feel pretty good about making this. I know there's a couple of scholars who are way more able to speak to this than I am in the crowd. You can just give me a little thumbs up so I, get some clout here. But I'm pretty comfortable saying that they kind of had the silent buy-in of the majority of the community. Thank you. Silent buy-in of the majority of the community, and the vocal buy-in of a large chunk of that. From there was also the British loyalists, because you have to understand that a large amount of the immigrants that were coming and were actually sold on this idea of the British Empire and service. And whether that was from their heart or just functionally, okay, this is what's going on now. And a lot of these were ex-British Indian military folks, a lot of ex-police folks who had served in Hong Kong, Shanghai, other places where the British Empire was. They left Punjab, or they were serving in other parts of India. And they're like, okay, well, here's another piece of the British Empire, Canada. And that clout is just going to transfer over onto the other side of the world. And they got here and they're like, actually, no, you're just a brown person and we don't like you. So that's what they kind of came up against. And that disillusionment led to a lot of them joining the Ghadar Party and founding the Ghadar Party, or being part of the founding of the Ghadar Party. But for others, it was well, we're still loyal servants of the British Crown. And we leveraged that relationship with the British in Punjab, for a more comfortable life than maybe we would have been afforded otherwise. And we can do the same thing here. And so this led to a divide between the community, where there were Ghadarites, as we call them, or Ghadari Babe, we might say in Punjabi, or just simply Ghadari. And then there was the Crown loyalists, who had a very close relationship with the immigration department of Canada. Now, a majority of the radical activity that was happening at the time, and I don't mean radical as in violence, I mean radical as in just going and be well, women aren't allowed into the country. So 2 Ghadar leaders went back and came back with their families on ships and be well, here we are, now what are you going to do? That kind of radical activism was coming out of the Ghadaris. But that doesn't mean that the Crown loyalists were divorced from civil rights struggles. They were definitely not in control of them, and they weren't leading them, but they had kind of this idea of if we work with the government, they even often used this the term of Aryan, to be North Indians are from the Aryan race, so our proximity to the British and to the Canadians is actually right there. They had that kind of approach. Now I have feelings about that kind of approach, if you can't tell, but I don't want to just paint it as they were just bad people who sold out to the British. They were human beings. They carried their own complexities and their own things of what they thought was right. But the Ghadaris were really the face of the community. They controlled the Khalsa Diwan Society, 2nd Avenue Gurdwara, for the majority of the time. And they were really the ones who were leading the civil rights struggles, along with the transnational struggle of the independence of India. Now, within these, there's going to be 4 characters I'm going to mention. And if you're not familiar with Punjabi names, this might be a little bit challenging because they all start with B. So there's 2 Ghadaris who I'm going to talk about specifically. Bhag Singh, who was the president of the Gurdwara, of the Khalsa Diwan Society, and Balwant Singh, who was the Granthi, or like the lead for devotional services. I don't like to use the word priest because people like to translate it, but I feel like that's a reductive translation. But Balwant Singh, they were Ghadar leaders, and the two most prominent Crown loyalists who worked for the immigration department were known as Bela and Babu. So I'll come back to them. I'll revisit names. Don't worry, you don't have to stress. There won't be a test, but just for your understanding. I'm going to come back to those four characters, but I'm going to come back to our two central characters. And that is first William C. Hopkinson. William Charles Hopkinson, super fascinating individual. Here's the fact. He was born in Allahabad in pre-partition India in 1876 to a British father and an Indian Hindu mother. Now, this was, being an Anglo-Indian at the time, was not the easiest thing in the world because you weren't really accepted as truly Indian and of the community, and you usually lived in like the spectrum of whiteness and in the white world, but you really didn't have pathways to be like, successful in that world. Hopkinson was born into this social location, social standing. He works as a police inspector in Calcutta until arriving in Canada in 1906, when he becomes an officer and interpreter for the Canadian Immigration Department in Vancouver. These are the facts of Inspector William C. Hopkinson. The other piece of this that's interesting is Hopkinson, when he arrives in Canada, erases his whole history. He rebrands, and in his rebranding, he does not tell people that he has an Indian Hindu mother. He says that he was born to two white parents in Yorkshire and was taken at a young age to India, where he learned how to speak Hindi and Punjabi and get familiar with local dialects, so he can kind of take a step into that world of white dominance. And so that's Hopkinson's story. Super interesting, like as a character study. And here's the other side of Hopkinson, which I like to call the extracurriculars. Hopkinson was employed to spy on Sikh and South Asian community for Canadian, US, and British governments. This is documented, like fact. He operated a ring of informants within the province. Again, documented fact. They were contract workers for the Canadian Immigration Department, the two prominent ones, Bela and Babu. And then where the accusations came in from both within the community and outside of the community were accusations of bribery, exploitation, immigration fraud, and conspiracy to murder, amongst other things. So, super fascinating. There were stories that even come up in court cases about how Hopkinson used to go into disguise, put a beard, because he had a darker complexion, being half Indian, that he used to put on a fake beard and a turban, and then go to like large gatherings of the community to just like gather information. I have a hard time believing that one, to be honest, because it was a small community, but the evidence actually points to the fact that this happened because it used to come up in like from his compatriots, from his allies. So it's bizarre, but it's there. That's Inspector Hopkinson. On the other side is Mewa Singh. Mewa Singh arrives in Canada the same year, likely, as Hopkinson in 1906. He's held in generally high regard by all sides of the Sikh and South Asian community, both the Ghadaris and the loyalists. He becomes an initiated Khalsa Sikh in June 1908 in Vancouver. The revelation of the Khalsa is why we celebrate Sikh Heritage Month in April, which took place in 1699. And he's employed as a mill worker and also volunteers to lead devotional practices at the Gurdwara. Now, I'd like to tell you that this is my very biased kind of perception of Mewa Singh, but this is well documented. Those two spies I mentioned earlier, Bela and Babu, in the Library and Archives of Canada, there's a document where they're reporting back on their activities of the day, and they talk about how they ran into Mewa Singh. This is in the summer of 1914, and Mewa Singh was like, hey, why don't you two come with me and I'll take you to the Ghadaris and we'll have a sit-down meeting and try to reconcile our differences, and you can stop going to the immigration department and I'll give you tickets, I'll pay for your tickets so you can return back to India, or I have property under my name, I'll sign that over to you just so we can all get along. This is people who should not be on board with him, being like, yeah, that was Mewa Singh offering us all that stuff. Even repeatedly, Bela and Babu, who work for the immigration department, talk about how Mewa Singh is like a pretty honest, truthful guy. Like, you know, like let's just kind of leave him alone. They don't want any business to do with him because they honestly feel pretty good about him as a person, right? So that's Mewa Singh. Now, why did the assassination happen? We're going to get into that. So 1914, the Komagata Maru is sitting in Burrard Inlet. It's June of 1914. And what happens is Pag Singh, Balwant Singh, the two Ghadar leaders, and a few other Ghadarites, they're like, it looks like this isn't going in our favor. So what we're going to do is we are going to jump across the border to Sumas, and we're going to get ammunition and firearms, and we're going to smuggle them onto the ship because we feel like the passengers might need them to protect themselves. So there's something in here, some kind of joke or commentary about jumping across to the States because of firearms, but I don't know what it is. I haven't found it. So Pag Singh, Balwant Singh, and another Ghadar leader by the name of Babu Harnam Singh, they grab Mewa Singh, who's usually hanging around the Gurdwara and just kind of in the community. They're like, hey, this is what we're going to go do. Want to jump in? And Mewa Singh's like, okay, sounds like a plan. Sounds fair. Jumps in. They go to Sumas and they get Mewa Singh, they get their firearms and ammunition. And when they're crossing back, now Balwant Singh, Pag Singh, Harnam Singh, they're persona non grata when it comes to the immigration department. So they don't want to have firearms on them while they're crossing the border. Mewa Singh is essentially a nobody in the eyes of the immigration department now. He's just some dude. And so Mewa Singh crosses the border with all of the firearms and ammunition on him. And there's wonderful stories that we've heard about like how he had pistols in his armpits and ammunition in his shoes, and then he gets caught and it's comically like just like has all of this stuff on him. And Mewa Singh gets taken in to interrogation, and the people interrogating him are Hopkinson and Bela Singh. Now I'm going to show you Mewa Singh's recount of what happens when he gets taken in. I can't read that, and you probably can't either, so let me pull it out over here. So this is Mewa Singh's talking about this is what happened. In Sumas, I had a case against me, and I got a pistol, and the immigration men caught me, and I was taken in front of the judge and was fined $58. After that case was dismissed, they brought another case against me, saying that I had brought the firearms from one country to the other, and at that time, Bela Singh, Hopkinson, and Reed went there. When I was locked up at Sumas, they took me out of the jail, and Hopkinson, Mr. Reed, who would be the senior officer of the immigration department, Mr. Reed and Bela Singh said, you have got to say that these pistols were for Pag Singh, Balwant Singh, and Harnam. When they took me out of the jail, Mr. Reed, Mr. Hopkinson, and Bela Singh said to me, I will get you off free if you say that Pag Singh, Balwant Singh, and Harnam have given you these pistols to give to Mr. Rahim, another Ghadar leader. I turned around and told them, you can cut me into little bits, but I will not tell you that lie for you. Bela Singh said this to me, but the others, Reed and Hopkinson, told Bela to say it to me. First of all, the three said it, and then Bela Singh kept on saying it to me. First of all, the three followed me around for days, and afterwards only Bela Singh. Mr. Hopkinson said to me again, I am all powerful. Now, Hopkinson was a relatively low-ranking official in the Canadian Immigration Department, but every communication to the South Asian community had to go through him because he was the one who spoke Hindi, who understood Punjabi, and he carried an enormous amount of influence on that community because he was their only entry point into the institution. So this quote from Hopkinson comes over and over again. I am all powerful. I am all powerful here in Vancouver. I am Vancouver. A pretty baller thing to say, if I'm going to be honest. Like, if I was trying to exert my power over somebody, that's what I'm going to say. But this comes up over and over again. This is corroborated by Mewa Singh's actual signed testimony. He doesn't implicate Pag Singh and Balwant Singh beyond what the actual activity was, that we all went across the border and they took me with them and we all brought these guns back there for the passengers of the Komagata Maru. So this all tracks with the actual statement that he ended up giving. He goes on to say more and more about how they were threatening him and whatnot. And so what happens here is Mewa Singh still gets left off with a small fine. of $40, relatively small fine, where the smuggling could have been a lot more. Hopkinson did this often, where he would get leniency for South Asian people, so he could then use here's a really racist pun, so he could curry their favor. Sorry, that was a joke from me. And then kind of get their buy-in for the future. This is from the BC archives right here at the RBCM. This is the discharge sheet from when Mewa Singh was let out of jail. It was very hard to track down, and this is part of the complexity of when you're researching racialized communities, misspellings of names. This was, first of all, written down incorrectly because Mewa Singh spelled his own name as M-E-W-A. It's written as M-A-I-W-A here by whoever was discharging him. But then the other piece is that in the archives, it was written as N-E-W-A, Mewa Singh. We never found this until 2015. So it was a nice little find. And then the bottom right of the slide is Mewa Singh's signature. That is his name in Punjabi, which was a beautiful thing to see the first time that we saw it. So you can see up there in the top left of the right corner is $43. That was how much he ended up paying to get out of jail. But then he kind of got a little bit of buy-in, like, okay, maybe Hopkinson, maybe there's something going on here. So he did start spending a little bit more time with Hopkinson, Bela Singh, and company. That happens in June of 1914. Now what happens is this case was really supposed to be big for Hopkinson because Bhag Singh, Balwant Singh were an issue for the government. If they kept walking around here in Vancouver, they were going to keep leading these charges against the government, the Ghadar movement, all of that stuff. If he sent them back to India and deported them, which would have been easy, they were deporting people like that. But you don't want to send those two back to India where they're just going to keep the Ghadar movement going forward. And this actually happens with Balwant Singh. So the option is for Hopkinson, who's not super far from doing things outside of the realm of the law, is to get rid of Bhag Singh and Balwant Singh. So September 5th, 1915, during a funeral in the Gurdwara, Bela Singh enters and opens fire in the middle of a funeral procession while Balwant Singh and Bhag Singh are in the Gurdwara in an attempt to assassinate Balwant Singh and Bhag Singh. This is from one of three newspapers. I ran out of time because I'm perpetually late, and as we like to say when we're late, and only when we're late, time is a colonial construct. But this is either from the Vancouver Daily World, the Vancouver Province, or the Vancouver Sun. Those are the only three newspapers I accessed when I was putting this together. But this is the newspaper, one of the newspaper accounts of the day. 8 Sikhs, members of a funeral party, were shot, 3 probably fatally last night while attending a religious ceremony at the Sikh temple, 1866 2nd Avenue West. Among those not expected to live is Bhag Singh, a priest at the temple. Another of the injured is Arjun Singh of Fraser Mills, brother of Arjun Singh, who was fatally shot Thursday night at 1474 3rd Avenue West, and for whose funeral the party had returned to the temple for the purpose of holding the final rites. The wounded were practically unanimous in their assertions to the police that the shooting was done by Bela Singh, member of the immigration department staff, whom they accused of opening fire upon them with 2 revolvers while they were at prayer. Another account, this account continues, according to the statement made at the hospital by Uttam Singh, the prayers were interrupted by Bela Singh rising to his feet and firing at Bhag Singh with 2 revolvers. The authorities were told that Bela Singh then turned the weapons on the other Sikhs who tried to escape. In the resulting confusion, several Sikhs leaped from the porch on the 2nd story of the temple, among them being Badan Singh, who, although suffering from 4 severe wounds, ran to another address where he sought shelter. There's another, I think I'll skip it. No, I won't. Yes, I will. So there's one more, I'll leave it up there. I won't skip it. I'll need to talk about it. This is pretty much uniform, some kind of account of this measure. Bela Singh comes into the Gurdwara, sits down, gets up through the procession, pulls out 2 revolvers, opens fires on Bhag Singh, who he's sitting beside. Balwant Singh, who was out of range, survives. Bhag Singh is assassinated there. He's killed by Bela Singh. And that is really the story that comes up over and over again. When we fast forward to Bela Singh's trial, the jury can't make, they start to claim self-defense. And all of these reports that the newspapers had gathered, which all never made a case of self-defense or never even alluded to self-defense, and even in the preliminary trials where Bela Singh's representatives didn't talk about self-defense, it didn't come up until it went to trial itself that it was self-defense. The first was a hung jury. They never made a decision. It went to trial a second time. The thought here is that Hopkinson and the immigration informants were going around and threatening folks to change their testimony. There's a large reason to believe this, and the large reason is because Bela Singh was not liked by the community. Was not. There's Professor Hugh Johnston writes that he was known as, quote, the best dressed Sikh in Vancouver, as meaning that he was on the government payroll, right? So he was always suited and booted and always looked good. When the Komagata Maru had first arrived in Vancouver and Burrard Inlet, the passenger shore committee who had organized to represent them, they sent a letter to the passengers of the Komagata Maru saying that you can trust any Sikh or any Indian that comes on board. One person you can't trust is Bela Singh. If he comes on board, you should tie him up and throw him into the ocean. So the fact that all these testimonies are changing is suspect. So Mewa Singh was at the Gurdwara this day. Here's a quote that was to the coroner from Balwant Singh, who was one of the suspected targets of the shooting. Mewa Singh then started a hymn. After that, Bishan Singh commenced the last hymn. I just heard that start when there was a shot from the corner. Bela Singh had 2 revolvers in his hands and was firing at the people who were sitting at the west side of the altar. The priest managed to get out from the room and hide in a small cubicle. So Mewa Singh saw this take place. And then I want to get a quote here from Mewa Singh's defense attorney. This comes much later, but he talks very explicitly about what's happening here at this time. And we have the primary sources and the legal documents in Library Archives Canada to back all of this up. Barrister Woods says that Bela Singh, an employee of the Immigration Department, was tried for this murder with 2 trials. On the first, the jury could not agree, and in the second came very nearly disagreeing. I have no comments to make with regard to Bela Singh other than to say that notwithstanding his acquittal, which is inexplicable to the Indian colony here, but I must say, speaking for myself, I do not understand the jury's verdict. However, a very important fact, which you can ascertain by inquiry, is that immediately after the shooting in the temple, Bela Singh made a statement when asked by the constable why he did the shooting. He explained in terms to the constable that, quote, Hopkinson and Reed, they know, go and ask them. Reed being the inspector of immigration in the city and Hopkinson an employee. This evidence was not allowed in the trial, but it throws a very lurid light on the situation, and Bela Singh's defense at the hearing was self-defense. This was never raised at the preliminary hearing at the coroner's inquest and only came up at the assizes. That document exists where Bela is saying in the preliminary hearing that talk to Reed and Hopkinson, they'll sort this out. In no uncertain term, that document exists and was not admitted into court. Super circumstantial. I'm not a lawyer. I don't care to prove anything here. It's not my purpose. I'm just saying, in the context of all the racism this is happening, this was another thing that sucks, at the very least, especially because the voice from the community was so loud of Hopkinson and Bela are our problem. They are the ones who are causing all of our issues. So what happens? I'm going to have to blitz through now. I had a lot of primary documents, but of course, true to form, I have talked way too long. So I'm going to blitz through this next part that I was going to do all through primary sources, but I'll do it through storytelling instead. And you can just trust that I'm borrowing from the primary documents. And so the assassination of Hopkinson takes place, being seen as the friction point of the community, being seen as the person who was the one that enabled, mobilized the government to enact all of this kind of harm. And with no certainty on where these orders of oppressing the community were coming from, Hopkinson was assassinated by Mewa Singh during the trial of Bela Singh. On October 21st, 1914, Mewa Singh comes into the Vancouver Provincial Courthouse, now the Vancouver Art Gallery, and pulls out 2 revolvers, point blank range, assassinates Hopkinson. He then is apprehended by the custodian of the provincial courthouse. He drops his weapons, and then he says, quote, "I shoot, I go station." Mewa Singh didn't speak English very well. Mewa Singh didn't have a large knowledge of the English language, and so this was perhaps a rehearsed line saying that I've shot him, take me to the police station. Didn't put up a fight. Gets taken to the police station. When he's taken to prison, he does not deny what he has done. He's rushed to trial October 30th, and on October 30th, within 90 minutes, I believe, he is sentenced to death by a jury. Why is the trial so quick? Because Mewa Singh first tried to refuse a defense attorney. Then he tried to, that wasn't agreed upon, he was given a defense attorney. Then he tried to plead guilty. That was not allowed. They entered a plea of not guilty so they could persecute him to the maximum extent of the law. So when the not guilty plea was not allowed, then it was entered as guilty. And then when it was the defense refused to cross-examine any witnesses. And then when Mewa Singh's defense came, they called 0 witnesses. The only thing they presented was one 11-page statement from Mewa Singh where he took full ownership of what he did, saying that I have absolutely done this, I've acted on my own, I've done it of my own accord. And I expect to be hanged and killed by the government. But these are the reasons why I've done it. So that Suma's story, that came up from that statement. He goes on and tells, do I have it in here? I guess not. But he goes on and talks about like all that Hopkinson has done, and he never mentions the Komagata Maru, which I think is a strategic choice to be like, this isn't revenge for the Komagata Maru, which was widely what it was being painted as, but rather it is a pattern of the oppression that he has been exercising against the community, and that we have no pathway to justice. And he says that explicitly, where we can't go to police officers, judges, or lawyers, or the courts because they won't hear our cases because we are not white. And he says these things explicitly in the statement. And then at the end, he says that if you are going to let me off because you agree with why I've done what I've done. So within 90 minutes, he's sentenced to death. This, again, one of the artifacts that exists here in the BC archives is Justice Ole Macaulay Morrison. Awesome name. Like, just so much rhyme. I always say it like I'm Matthew McConaughey in my head. Ole Macaulay. His notes from the trial are here in the BC archives, this is a snapshot of. And it's very open and shut, right? I can get into all the specific racism that happens at the trial. It's very fun. It's very textured. It's very illuminating. But I won't. I'll go straight to the hanging of Mewa Singh because this is where the negotiation of criminality starts, that conversation. The hanging of Mewa Singh takes place on January 11th, 1915. It happens in his cell. He's hanged by probably the most prolific hangman in the history of Canada, Arthur Ellis. And the only person who witnesses the hanging is the Granthi of the Gurdwara. There's conflicting reports of who that Granthi was, but that's the only person who witnesses it. After that, 156 are gathered outside of the jail where the body is turned over to them, and in a procession, they march it to Fraser Mills, which you might be familiar with, which used to be its own municipality between Coquitlam and New Westminster, present day, right behind the IKEA, where the IKEA and Coquitlam, along the water. There used to be a Gurdwara there, a Gurdwara where they say, and a mill where they say Fraser Mills, where Mewa Singh worked. And they took his body in a procession, and another artifact here that exists in the BC archives is a ticket to view the hanging of Mewa Singh, which was kindly recreated by the museum last year for Sikh Heritage Month and put on display. And this procession marched his body to Fraser Mills, where his last rites took place, his funeral. And this image of Mewa Singh's funeral also exists here at the BC archives of our last image of Mewa Singh right before his funeral pyre is lit. Every year since 1916, 1917, there's a gap in 16, we don't know what happened there, Mewa Singh's anniversary of his execution is celebrated as a Shaheed Divas. And Shaheed Divas means Day of Martyrdom within the Sikh and South Asian communities, especially down the West Coast. But for sure, in a big way, first at Fraser Mills, and then when that Gurdwara closed, in the Gurdwara Khalsa Diwan Society in Vancouver, and then now it's pretty much everywhere in the Lower Mainland. On the 100th anniversary of Mewa Singh's execution, there was a ceremonial walk along the same streets to recreate the steps that the initial procession took when they were taking Mewa Singh's body to Fraser Mills. And you can see the Sikh community gathered here to do that. But it's this really big divorcing of realities when you're talking about this conversation, a cognitive dissonance. When I grew up with this story, I grew up with it not academically. I grew up with it in Gurdwaras. I grew up with it from my mom, who shared it with me as a story. And it was within a lineage of understanding of Sikhs sacrificed themselves for the greater good. So it was told in the vein of assassinations and executions of Sikhs that have happened since the 16th century. Now, when I grew up with that understanding, the first time I went to the New Westminster Quay as a kid, I had heard just by rumors that this is where Mewa Singh's funeral was. It wasn't, but that's where the story was. Oh, this is where the funeral was. In my head, I was like, well, if this is his Shaheed Asthan, his place of martyrdom, there must be a monument. I have no scope of that this is a criminal in the public discourse. So I was like going up and down the quay looking for like a statue or a plaque. I was like, there must be something. And I saw a bust from far away, maybe top 3 disappointment in my whole life. I saw a bust from far away and I saw a beard and I was like, there it is. Let's go. We got it. I ran over to it. It was Simon Fraser. Oh man, the cosmic irony of that. It was Simon Fraser. I was disappointed. I grew up. My politics grew. And now I'm more disappointed that it was Simon Fraser there. But then that's when my passion for like wanting to know, like, was this when Mewa Singh was executed? And then coming across this, like, as I grew up and then like starting to study history in university and that kind of thing, developing my own personal relationship with the archives, both here at RBCM, the New West Archives, close to home. That's where the story kind of came to life for me. And I understood, like, there's nuances to this story. There's multiple things at play here. There was this paper that was written out of UVic, and this is probably the last thing that I'll share, a little while ago, a few years ago, which was about the ambiguity, about the importance of looking at this story in its ambiguity, because it's usually told for a reason. Within the Sikh community, South Asian community, it's for the reason that we celebrate, and this is a tradition, we celebrate our martyrs. And that is the reason that it's told. And then otherwise, it's told in the context of like why this was a criminal action. And it's like to allow the story to exist in its ambiguity is an exercise in critical reflexivity. And that's a wonderful paper. I enjoyed it a lot. And there's a lot of good stuff there. The one thing that I like that sits with me though from that story is that it's putting the community history, which isn't divorced from fact, but exists in a different sensibility. It's putting it at an equal power play as the institutional history to be like, it's nice to let this live in ambiguity. And it's like, yeah, that is nice and it's good and it's whole. But another thing that would be nice is to give community histories the power that we give institutional histories, right? If we're apologizing for the Komagata Maru in 2016 on a federal level, but we're leaving things, relics of the Komagata Maru uninterrogated on our monuments, there's an inherent issue there, right? So this negotiation of criminality is like, Mewa Singh was never shared to us as a criminal. Can I stand here and be like, I understand why he's seen as a criminal in the institution? Absolutely, I can. Will I ever stop thinking of him as a criminal? Absolutely, I won't. But can I accept that those two things can exist and that we can take the narrative forward from here? Absolutely, but it needs that space to do so. And to do it, we can't just be okay with the ambiguity. We need to honor the fact that there is a counter narrative that isn't divorced from fact, right? That exists with a relationship to fact. And then we can start talking about truth telling. We can start talking about reconciling complex narratives. We can start talking about, the multiplicity of narratives, but we need to have all of that happen. We can't just leave Mewa Singh on a list of criminals. We can't just leave Hopkinson on a monument and be like, and now we go about our lives. And that's one story of how many folks who were criminalized in the advent of what we call Canada. So I'll leave you with that thought. And the last image that I'll share with you is the power of community archive is this artifact that's been shared with the public for the first time in history this year. And this is the first time in our lives that we have heard Mewa Singh's voice, because Mewa Singh's voice has not existed in the Punjabi language, and we know he didn't speak English much. This is a letter penned by Mewa Singh to the community in Stockton when he was on death row, days before his execution. This is the first time we have seen Mewa Singh as a community, and we got to hear his voice, and it was a powerful moment for us, because this letter has existed, it's been seen, but it hasn't been publicly accessible. It's accessible now on the namelesscollective.ca, which I have to plug, which is the South Asian Canadian history podcast that I have the privilege of being a part of. If you are interested, you can. It's told in a conversational format with my colleagues and my really close friends, Mewa Singh and Naveen Gurn. So with that, you have 4 minutes for questions, I guess. I'm cool to stick around a little bit longer if I don't know if people have to get back to work, or depending on if your boss is in the room, pretend to get back to work.